Kevin Riley unlocked the front door, took off his shoes, and walked down the hall to the kitchen. He had just driven his wife, Carrie, to the airport where she was to board an 8-hour commuter flight to the state capital. It was her 3-day bi-weekly business trip to perform secretarial duties for her boss, Bradley Knox III, or as Kevin always called him, Trey. Every time he used that nickname for her boss's pretentious official name, Carrie reminded him that her boss couldn't stand him. Although he never admitted it to his wife, it was one of the reasons he always found a way to slip that nickname into the conversation. She may have thought Bradley Knox III was a great guy, but Kevin didn't care for him. Something about him seemed fake. He glanced at his watch and saw that it was only 7:30 in the morning, which left him plenty of time to make it to the store by 9 when it opened. He had time for another cup of coffee, and as he poured it, he realized he had time to check his email and maybe surf the internet a bit. He wasn't much of a fan of computers or the internet, but he'd discovered that email was a good way to keep in touch with some of the people he'd gone to trade school with. There were 4 of them, and they had all studied together, learning the intricacies of diesel mechanics. The other 3 took jobs out of town, and he was lucky enough to get a job with one of the big heavy equipment sales and service firms right here in his hometown. In his 30S, Kevin was one of 3 head mechanics and had a crew of 5 under him. Just because he led the group didn't mean he didn't have to pull wrenches with the rest of them. He still got just as dirty as they did, even though he mostly dealt with fuel systems. Kevin liked his job, even though it could mean unexpected overtime and having to work out of town sometimes. At least he didn't have to travel as much as Carrie did. She'd only been working at the law firm of Crosby & Knox for 6 months, getting the job a week after she'd completed the advanced training required to move from a real estate clerkship to a higher-paying legal secretarial position. She and Kevin had met in college when they were each learning their craft. That was over 8 years ago, and they have been married for 6 years now. When they were married, Kevin had just started working in a store, and Carrie was hired as a secretary at a local real estate firm. Working together, the 2 of them were able to put a down payment on the house they now lived in. The opportunity to move into a home of their own came less than 2 years after they started their careers, something they were both proud of. After drinking his coffee, Kevin headed down the hallway to the spare bedroom where their computer stood. He hoped it was still on because he'd noticed Carrie using it for a few minutes after getting dressed and ready. At least he wouldn't have to wait for it to boot up if she left it on. As he entered the room, he watched the picture they had used as a screensaver slowly move across the screen in its haphazard journey across the face of the monitor. "Damn, we don't look bad," he said to the empty house as he watched their picture move in front of him. They were lying side by side on lounge chairs, surrounded by nothing but white sand, with the blue of the Persian Gulf stretching out behind them. Both of them were well-tanned, smiling and wearing the shortest of bathing suits. It was one of many photos taken during their vacation in Cancun 18 months ago. Both were wearing sunglasses, so you couldn't see his gray eyes or Carrie's blue eyes, but you couldn't see much behind them. Carrie's blonde hair was lighter than his sun-bleached light brown hair, and his tan almost matched. When the 2 of them lay in the chairs, you couldn't tell she was 4 inches shorter than he was. He didn't want to use the picture as a screensaver, but Carrie wouldn't let him use one of the pictures that had been taken when they spent the day on the resort's nude beach. She was afraid that her parents or someone else she didn't want to see would somehow enter the room when the picture was on the screen. Having listened to her concerns, he'd left the photos in a secure folder hidden behind a password. Perhaps if he'd had time, he would have gone through that folder quickly before heading to work to pay homage to Carrie's lush 36C. But considering he'd have to spend the next 2 nights alone in their bed, he decided that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. After watching their photo move from the right edge diagonally to the top of the screen, he finally clicked to remove the splash screen. The photo and black background disappeared, and he saw that an email from Carrie's email account at Crosby & Knox had appeared on the screen. He wondered why she'd left it on the screen. After all, she'd told him their corporate system had to be secure for a myriad of legal reasons. She'd always been paranoid, fearing he'd see her messages when she logged into the corporate account from home. After a second's thought, he glanced at the top of the screen, where he saw the familiar hourglass figure looming over the exit command. He realized what had happened. Their malfunctioning high-speed modem had failed again. Every week or so it stopped communicating with the cable company's equipment, and the only way to get it working again was to power down the modem. Such a crude reset always got it back in working order. He was just reaching for the modem to turn it off when a phrase from the email Carrie had left in her haste that morning appeared on the screen. The phrase underwear caught his attention, and looking at it, he couldn't figure out why it was in an email on her work account. At that moment, he jerked his hand away from the modem and froze, reading the email his wife had received from her boss that morning. It wasn't very long, but the words pierced him like a spear. Carrie, I hope I catch you before you leave. I really want you to bring that black bra I gave you on our last trip, with the teal accents. You didn't get a chance to wear them for me. My first meeting with the governor isn't until 2 p.m., so we might have enough time for you to wear them, and I took them off for you this morning. Bradley. He reread the message 3 times, hoping it would somehow clarify its meaning beyond the obvious. All he was left with, however, was the obvious. Carrie was having an affair with Trey, her boss. Kevin hadn't realized it, but if any of the witnesses had seen him sitting at the computer, his description would have been that he was staring at the screen, periodically opening and closing his mouth like a goldfish in a bowl. Finally, Kevin shook his head and staggered to his feet, pushing his chair so hard that it bounced off the wall as he left the room. He knew which black bra Trey was talking about. He'd seen them in Carrie's underwear drawer when she'd packed, and they were still there when she'd closed and buttoned her suitcase. He prayed it was still there now because that could mean the letter was a joke, some kind of sick joke. His hand shook as he opened the drawer, and it was clear that the black bra with the blue-green bows on the clasp was no longer there. He quickly checked all of her drawers, hoping she had simply moved them, but there were none. Realizing that his wife had come back into the room and taken the missing underwear with her, Kevin sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to remember what Carrie had told him about them when she brought them home. Kevin saw them as she was unpacking and took them from her hands with the words, "For me? I mean for you to wear them for me?" He remembers grinning stupidly. Carrie gave him a token smile as she took them from his hands and said, "Not today. I bought them on sale for half price at Victoria's Secret, but they were still expensive." He remembered her putting them in a drawer, and they didn't come to his mind until the morning. They made love that night, as they always did when Carrie returned from her bi-weekly trips. She didn't need underwear, she could always get it done just by being near him. Kevin sat for a few minutes thinking about the letter and the underwear. He finally decided that it couldn't mean what it seemed to mean. There were no signs or signals that he always thought should be present if a wife was cheating on her husband. She was as loving as ever and longed to be with him. He couldn't remember the last time they'd had a serious disagreement, let alone a fight, and their lovemaking had happened more often than during Mexican vacations. There just had to be something he'd missed that would explain this message. He went back to the computer and manipulated the browser's stop button, going from screen to screen so he could get back to a normal cursor. With any luck, her logout command hadn't gone through, and he'd be able to look at her email account and see if there was anything else from the bastard there. Mentally crossing his fingers, he rebooted the modem and waited for the green lights to reappear on it. When they did, he scrutinized her email and the folders displayed on the web page behind it. Scrolling down a message about underwear, he looked closer and saw that the only open folder was Inbox, clicked on it, and found 4 more messages. Opening them one by one, he found that each one had to do with legal matters that meant nothing to him. He began to fear that he might have nothing more to use in trying to find out what was going on between Carrie and her boss, if anything at all. When he started looking through the names of her folders, he got lucky. Between the folders with the names of the 2 local companies was another one labeled Personal. He didn't hesitate to click on it, hoping it was the folder he was looking for. The folder was full of message headers, and he saw that about half of them were from her boss. The folder was sorted by date, and he gingerly opened the first message, afraid of what he might find there. The first message was very long, and as he read it, the colors and emotions faded from his face. He reread it a second time, gritting his teeth. When he finished the second reading, he reached over, turned on the printer, and printed out the entire letter. While the letter was printing, he happened to glance at his watch and saw that he would be late if he didn't leave for work immediately. There was no way he could concentrate on work, so he grabbed his cell phone and called in sick, which wasn't too far from the truth. The printer had already finished, so he closed the message he had read and printed, and moved on to the next one. He moved mechanically for the next hour, selecting and reading messages, printing most of them, and then forwarding copies of them to his personal email account. By the time he was done with the messages, his eyes filled with tears, and he realized that his marriage was over. After looking through Carrie's email at Crosby & Knox one last time and finding nothing suitable, he took her off the corporate site and moved to his own email account. He created a separate folder and moved all forwarded messages into it. The last thing he did was change his password, since he couldn't remember if Carrie knew his old password. He wanted those emails to remain accessible in case he needed to print out more copies. Shutting down the computer, he took the printed messages and his now-cooled cup of coffee and returned to the kitchen. Taking a beer from the refrigerator, he sat down at the kitchen table and reread the messages one more time. He was surprised at how much they told him, especially when compared to what he remembered of the last 6 months and Carrie and Trey's trips to the state capitol. Carrie had only been at her new job for a week when she had been told that she would have to accompany her boss to the Capitol to take depositions, find and print out anything he might need from the corporate files, and generally provide any assistance he needed. Their firm lobbied the governor's office on behalf of local businesses and businessmen and represented other clients in state courts. When she had first told him about it, it had all seemed so honorable. Now he realized that Trey was probably targeting his wife and that some of the trips didn't require her presence for business purposes. He could also see that Carrie was soon volunteering for her meetings with Trey. Recovering the emails, Kevin realized that it was likely that Trey had seduced his wife on the second trip, although it was possible that it had happened on the first trip as well. The first email in her personal folder was Trey's response to her letter, in which she thanked him for the beautiful Gucci purse he had given her and the wonderful dinner they had enjoyed together. She also mentioned how much she enjoyed everything else, though what that meant was not specified in the message. However, his reply did mention their night together, so Kevin guessed exactly what she meant. That first message also explained the purse she had suddenly appeared with a few months ago. When he'd asked how she'd managed to buy it, she'd laughed and called it a $40 knockoff that she'd purchased at a kiosk at the mall. The realization that her deception had started so long ago and how easily she lied made him nauseous. This was no longer the Carrie he remembered and loved. The correspondence continued regularly, usually before or just after one of their trips. He assumed they communicated in person between trips without needing email, or that the messages she kept were more important to her. It was impossible to find out, and to be honest, it didn't really matter. By the third or fourth email, he had learned how they kept their dates hidden from him and the corporate office. They always stayed at the same hotel and booked the same 2 rooms. Kevin didn't notice it, but every night when he called her around 10 o'clock in room 612 of the Hyatt Inn, she was there waiting for his call. After he called her, she would join Trey in his room for the night. He seemed to become so predictable that the two of them could play him like a trout. Their jokes about how they wished he'd called a little earlier so they could get together sooner cut him like a razor. He'd never seen this side of Carrie before, though it matched his impressions of her boss quite well. Another letter explained the expensive diamond earrings Carrie had worn to the Crosby and Knox Christmas party. She had told him they were cubic zirconia, but the letter implied they were real, a very expensive Christmas gift from her lover. In the folder was again a message from Trey thanking her for the extravagant gift. Kevin thought she'd gone overboard with her thanks, but he wondered how she'd thanked him personally. He couldn't believe that the only time they were together was once every 2 weeks for 2 nights at the Hyatt Inn. He was sure they must see each other from time to time and at other times, and finally on a second reading of one of the last emails he got a clue when Trey mentioned working at the condominium. After some concentrated thought, Kevin remembered that Carrie had once told him that her boss lived on the 9th floor of a condominium overlooking the river park. It now seemed likely that the two of them had met during the day at his condominium, either under the pretense of working there or perhaps during lunch. If she did have fun with Trey during the week while she was in town, as he was now certain, she was very careful to clean up any evidence of it before returning home. Of course, it might just be a case of him fitting into the image of the blind and trusting husband. It was almost noon when he finished rereading all the letters and set them aside. He knew he had to decide what to do before Carrie returned to town with Trey. She usually flew in early Friday morning and came straight home from the airport in a cab. Most of the time, she would call him at work to let him know she had gotten home safely. Ironically, the biggest danger had already caught up with her while she was out of town. Kevin slowly got up from the kitchen table and grabbed 2 more bottles of beer from the refrigerator before heading into the living room, where he stretched out on the couch with the first of the bottles in his hand. He noticed it was already noon and wondered where the time had gone. It seemed almost 5 hours had passed since he'd entered the house, dropping his wife off so she could meet her lover at the airport. He realized that the two of them must have planned this carefully, because he rarely saw Trey when he escorted Carrie to the airport. A couple times he could be spotted in the departure lounge, but he always completely ignored the two of them. By 6 o'clock that evening, Kevin was barely conscious. He went to the bathroom and then to the kitchen several times during the day, each time bringing 2 more beers into the living room. The last attempt, however, was unsuccessful. There was no more beer in the refrigerator. Pausing for a moment, he looked at the row of empty bottles on the kitchen table and realized that there were 12 of them, the entire contents of the 2-packs he had bought just the day before. They were supposed to last at least a couple weeks, and under normal circumstances they would have. Now, however, after drinking the whole dozen and eating nothing, he was in dire need of sleep. He managed to make it to the bed before he passed out, fully clothed, on top of a blanket. It was 10:15 when the ringing of the phone brought Kevin out of the state his thoughts had taken him into when he passed out. It was a place full of images of Carrie and himself doing things they'd enjoyed since they'd met 8 years ago. As he struggled to get to his feet, a glance at his watch told him that it was probably Carrie calling to find out why he hadn't called her at the Hyatt Inn. Everything he'd learned came over him with renewed vigor, and he decided to wait until she got home to confront her. The answering machine was just starting to pick up the call when he picked up and said, "Hello? Is that you, Carrie?" "Yes, it's me." "Why aren't you calling? You always call at this time? Is something wrong?" He could hear the concern in her voice, and he wondered why. In anger, he almost said he was sorry for not letting her get to Trey's bed on time, but held back and replied, "I'm sorry, Carrie. I fell asleep." A flicker of hope flashed through his mind that the tone of his voice hadn't given away his true feelings. But then he wondered why he should even bother with that. "You've never done this before. What's wrong?" Her voice gave away his displeasure, and he almost decided to answer that he knew, but again he decided against it. Instead, he replied as politely as he could, "I had a couple beers after work and I guess they knocked me out." He decided to go on the offensive and asked, "So how was your day? Were you busy this morning? Hopefully Trey won't be too hard on you." Carrie hesitated for a moment before replying, "No, I wasn't very busy." "Why do you ask that? You almost never ask me about my work here." "No reason, just keeping the conversation going. Things are as good here as could be expected. How are things going for you? Are you doing well?" He decided to throw another question in her direction to see her reaction. She quickly replied, "What do you mean? Of course I'm behaving well. Why are you asking me that?" He noticed the concern in her voice again. He took his time answering, "I'm just kidding. I know you'll never be on your best behavior. I trust you completely, and I know my trust is safe with you." She looked a little embarrassed and replied, "Of course you do. I just wonder why you say that. You've never said anything like that before. Just forget about it. I didn't mean anything like that." He waited a few seconds before continuing, "I'll probably go to bed. The beer seems to be putting me to sleep." "Okay, Kevin, I'll let you go. Be sure you get a good night's sleep. Love you." There was no way Kevin could repeat those last 2 words to her, so he said, "Okay, I will. Goodbye, Carrie." He hung up the phone and headed to the bathroom where he got rid of the last remnants of his beer. He felt a little better after a few hours of sleep, though he certainly wouldn't be getting behind the wheel. He returned to the kitchen and sat down by the phone, stoically waiting for 15 minutes to pass. After that time had elapsed, he dialed the Hyatt Inn, a number he remembered from the times he'd called there more than once, and asked for the number 612. He wasn't surprised when the phone went unanswered for a dozen rings before he finally hung up. He wondered if they were joking about some new plan to get him to call her earlier in the future, and also wondered if his inability to call Carrie would affect their date tonight. In the end, he decided that he absolutely didn't care, but then he realized that they would probably have fun while he sat here thinking about it. That realization brought tears to his eyes again, and he stumbled back to bed. The next morning, he was surprised when he didn't feel too guilty for his overindulgence the previous night. After showering, he felt well enough to go to work, though his mind was on Carrie, not fuel filters, injectors, and precision fuel pumps. He performed his tasks robotically, and more than one of the employees looked at him questioningly when he didn't seem to understand what he was being told. He was very glad when the day was over. All his thoughts about Carrie and the fact that she was cheating on him with her boss solved nothing. On the way home, he bought a couple burgers and fries, not the kind of food he usually ate. He had no appetite, though, so it didn't matter what he ate. He washed them down with 2 bottles of beer out of the 6 he'd grabbed on the way home. He knew he couldn't drink a dozen beers every night, so he purposely set aside the second six-pack he'd started to pick up at the cash register. At 8 o'clock, he called room 612 at the Hyatt Inn, but after 10 rings, there was no answer. Email told him that Carrie was only in the room from 9:30 to 10, the usual time for his nightly calls. As an experiment, he called the room every half hour, making his fourth call at 9:25. None of the calls brought an answer, and after 10 rings, he hung up each time. The last time he called at 9:45, Carrie answered the second call. "Hey, Kevin. Looks like you didn't get any sleep tonight. You're calling just in time. I was just about to get under the covers to get a good night's sleep, but I thought I'd better wait for you to call." She laughed. "I didn't sleep tonight, Carrie. I was just watching TV and waiting for it to be time to call you. How about you? How did you spend your evening?" He hoped she wasn't alarmed by his question. He knew he'd asked her questions like that many times before, so he didn't think she'd be perplexed as to why he was asking. "I was doing the same thing you were doing, Kevin. Just lying here watching TV. In fact, I just turned it off. Before that, I took a long, hot bath." She was very talkative, and it seemed to Kevin that she didn't suspect him at all. "That's good, Carrie. You should be well rested for tomorrow night. We'll have to think of something to keep you busy when you get back." She giggled and said, "So you're already making plans, huh? I can't wait." They talked for another 5 minutes without saying anything important. Kevin realized she was telling him one lie after another and finally said, "I have to go. I have a couple more things to do before I go to bed. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye." "Bye, sweetie. I'm looking forward to tomorrow night. Love you." Kevin hung up without saying another word to her. He waited again for 15 minutes, patiently glancing at his watch before calling room 612 of the Hyatt Hotel, and again the phone went unanswered after 10 rings. The next day, Kevin showed up for work at the usual time, but excused himself early after lunch. He wanted to be home when Carrie arrived from the airport and be ready to meet her. He had no idea how that would happen, but he knew they weren't going to spend the night under the same roof. One of them would find a new place to live before nightfall, and it didn't matter to him which one it was. He was home a little after 1 o'clock and knew he'd probably have to wait about an hour before she arrived. Considering how lousy he'd felt when he'd found out what was going on, it surprised him how patiently he waited for her now. It was like an emptiness had formed in his chest, and he knew tears were just around the corner. But by an effort of will, he forced himself to get through the next couple hours with a sense of dignity. He spent hours going over their entire life together in his mind, and all he could remember were the good things. The letters and what happened after he found them seemed to belong to another universe. They didn't fit into any of his memories of Carrie. He was standing at the kitchen sink when he heard her open the front door. A moment later, he heard the wheels of her luggage rolling down the hallway, approaching him and their last seconds as a couple. When she entered the kitchen, he thought she didn't notice him. "Kevin, what are you doing here? Why aren't you at work?" There had been surprise on her face when she saw him, but now it was replaced with concern. "I've been waiting for you, Carrie." He spoke very smoothly, without any emotion, and his face was in the same state. She looked at him with even more concern and replied, "You've been waiting for me. Why?" He did not answer her, but instead picked up a stapled bundle of letters and threw it on the table in front of her. She glanced at him once more and then reached for the papers. Her concerned look was replaced by curiosity, but it was soon replaced by shock. Her face lost color as she flipped through the first sheet and the rest of the pages, lingering her gaze on each one for only a fraction of a second. When she reached the last one, she threw them back on the table and stood like that for a few moments while the color slowly returned to her face. She didn't look at him, saying, "Well, you know." After hesitating for a few more moments, she continued, "Where did you get it from?" "It's from my email at work." Modem? It was all he could manage to get out, as he had to stop to get his emotions under control. Carrie thought quickly and nodded her head. "The modem broke again, and my email stayed on the screen, didn't it?" When Kevin found the ability to speak calmly, he said, "Yes. If it hadn't been for that, I probably never would have found out. You've been very good at keeping this whole affair a secret." Carrie said nothing more and seemed to think for a moment, then slowly turned around and pulled a cell phone out of her purse. A few seconds later, she was already speaking into the receiver, standing with her back to Kevin. "Kevin knows. Doesn't matter how he knows, does it? Yes. I'll call a cab. I'll meet you there. Bye. She closed the phone and partially turned to Kevin, then said, I'm going to leave. I'm sorry you found out this way. I'll be back tomorrow for the rest of the stuff. She turned to leave again, taking her travel bag with her. Kevin looked at her back in disbelief and exclaimed angrily, That's it? No explanation at all? You're only sorry that I found out this way? Carrie replied, What's there to explain? I've been with Bradley so much in the last 6 months that being with him completely must become the norm very quickly. He's been so good to me. You can't compete, Kevin. I'm so sorry. Tears that were close to the surface came out when Kevin said, Good for you. What's all this money he's spending on you? I know about the purse, earrings, and some other things. Is that what this is about? He had to stop talking because he was starting to lose control of his words. Carrie hesitated before answering. Gifts are only part of the deal. Bradley does everything upscale, and I'm ready to live upscale. After she finished speaking, she walked down the hallway to their bedroom and stayed there for almost 5 minutes, while Kevin tried to pull himself together. He found it very hard to believe that this was all about what Trey was capable of giving her. He knew they were still years away from any semblance of an affluent lifestyle, but the Carrie he knew never complained. Was he really that wrong about her? When she returned from the bedroom, she had a fully stuffed garment bag in her hands. She must have hailed a cab from the bedroom because just as she reached the kitchen, 2 short car horns sounded in front of the house. Without further conversation, Carrie gathered her travel bag and walked out the front door. Kevin silently followed her, watching as the cab driver hurried down the sidewalk to pick up her luggage. She got into the cab and waited for the driver to pull away before casting a quick glance at Kevin. He wasn't sure, but he thought she was crying. When he got back to the kitchen, Kevin asked, What the hell just happened here? There was no one to answer, so he sat down at the kitchen table and tried to work out the situation with his once loving wife. The next day, Saturday, Kevin was still in shock and couldn't believe that Carrie had walked away from their marriage, their home, and him so easily. Just after noon, she called and said she was coming to pick up the rest of her things. When she arrived, her father was with her, bringing their van and a few empty boxes. While the two of them carried the boxes into the bedroom, Kevin made his way into the living room and sat quietly on the couch. A few minutes later, Kevin was joined by Carrie's father, Joseph Kane. They sat in silence for several minutes before Kevin spoke. Did she tell you what's going on? Asked Kevin. Her father looked a little embarrassed, but finally replied, I'm sorry, Kevin. She seems to have made up her mind already. Her mother and I don't understand why she would want to leave you for her boss. We've never met the man, but he must be really wonderful to be a better choice than you. Kevin was still confused and said, I guess it's just a matter of what he can give her. That's all she said, and it doesn't make any sense. He looked at his father-in-law and continued, I know it sounds wrong, but that's all I can say. She didn't tell me she loved him, or that she stopped loving me. Joseph was quiet for a moment, but finally asked, Does it really matter? Kevin thought for a moment before answering, No, I guess not. She's been sleeping with him regularly for months now. I can't forgive that, even if it seemed like she wanted to. The two men continued to sit in silence until Carrie came out and said, I have everything I want to keep. Anything else you find, you can do what you want with it. Give it away or throw it out with the trash. There were tears in her eyes as she took a quick glance around the living room, then proceeded to walk outside with one of the boxes. Her father followed her with another and then returned a few more times to pick up the remaining boxes. When they left, Kevin returned to his bedroom and noticed that there were still a few of her things in the closet that Carrie had been using. He opened the drawers of the dresser that belonged to her and saw that there were a few things in there as well. The underwear drawer still held a few sets that he remembered giving her for birthdays and Valentine's days. He picked up one of the bras he'd given her and threw it back into the drawer in disgust. She could at least take them with her and then throw them away. It feels like she wants to rub herself against it. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a couple of green garbage bags. After a few minutes, he folded the remains of her clothes into them and tied them up to give to the needy. Another bag with the makeup and toiletries she'd left in the bedroom and bathroom went in the trash. An hour later, there was no sign left in the 2 rooms that Carrie had ever lived in them. He knew he'd probably find other things, but for now he was satisfied that he'd gotten rid of the last obvious traces of her presence. He spent the rest of the day lying on the bed they had once shared and thinking about what he should have done and the various scenarios for revenge. Eventually, he realized that although he was angry, he wasn't a violent or vengeful person, and that he would be better off devoting his energies to simply forgetting about her, as difficult as that might be. The weekend was soon over, though Kevin couldn't remember much about it. He'd grabbed a couple more packs, and now they all lay in the trash can, stripped of their original contents. He knew that drinking himself into oblivion wasn't his style, but it was the only way to get through the weekend. Trying to figure out why Carrie did what she did was driving him crazy, and the only solution was to force himself to stop asking the question. By Monday morning, he felt a little better, coming to terms with the facts of what had happened, whether or not he could explain them. Neither Monday nor Tuesday at work did he care. On Tuesday, he called the Crosby and Knox office to get a forwarding address for Carrie's mail. He wasn't transferred to it when he asked. Instead, the receptionist returned a few minutes later and told him that Carrie would email him whatever he needed. Later that evening, when he checked his email, there was one email from Carrie's work account, containing only the forwarding address she'd used, an address he recognized as the address of the 9th floor apartment where Trey lived. Wednesday started out as a normal workday for Kevin until mid-morning when he was called into his office for a phone call. It was his bank demanding that he do something about a mortgage payment that had just defaulted on his account. After a few minutes of heated discussion with the bank's loan officer, Kevin discovered that both of the bank accounts he and Carrie maintained now had zero balances. A few more questions revealed the fact that a total of almost $20,000 had been transferred out of those accounts on Monday. Kevin found himself in a money crunch, and although he could hardly afford it, he put things on hold for the time it took to try and sort out the mess. The first thing he did was to go straight to the law firm of Crosby and Knox. He was furious with Carrie and was going to insist that half the cash be returned to the accounts. In his opinion, she had stolen almost $10,000 from him. He was on edge when he entered the law office, bypassed the receptionist, and headed straight for Carrie's desk. She didn't see him coming and looked up startled when he started talking loudly to her from 10 feet away. "What the hell are you doing embezzling from both of our bank accounts? I want half of that money back now." Bradley Knox III took a moment to step out of his office to see what was going on, and as soon as Kevin saw him, he changed course toward the lawyer in the three-piece suit. Kevin managed to get within 2 feet of him, but at that moment his office door slammed shut. He heard the deadbolt turn as he rattled the doorknob. Obviously, talking to Trey wasn't going to happen anytime soon. He quickly turned around to Carrie, just in time to keep her from leaving the table. She quickly sat back down in her seat, her face and neck flushed heavily and a look of embarrassment on her face. "Well, where's my money, Carrie? What do you think you're doing? Is this all so much about money that you're willing to take something that doesn't belong to you?" Kevin was practically shouting by now, and people all over the office were listening to him and began to discreetly gather nearby, eager to see what was going on. Carrie finally found her speech and said, "I'm taking the money, and you can have the car, the house, and the furniture." She rummaged through the pile of envelopes and packages, waiting for the courier, and pulled out an envelope which she slipped into his hand. "Here's everything, and if you want to argue, get a lawyer. I was really hoping you'd get this before you found out the money was missing, and I think you'll find it's quite fair." No sooner had he opened the envelope than 2 security guards ran up to him, both with tasers hanging from their belts. One of them said, "You'd better leave right now. If you don't leave immediately, you will be charged. We are authorized to use these tasers, so don't defy us." Kevin realized that if he didn't do as they said, it wouldn't lead to anything good, and turned to leave, saying, "You've turned into one money-hungry bitch. I don't understand how you could have changed so much. The Carrie I remember wouldn't have acted like this." He cast another glance in the direction of Carrie's boss's locked office and shouted, "Stay in your office, Trey, you coward." He noticed that several of Carrie's co-workers chuckled at his remark, clearly enjoying the timid lawyer's reaction to Kevin's visit. Walking back to his car, he opened the envelope. He soon realized that Carrie had given Trey all the details of their assets and liabilities, and he had entered them into a spreadsheet that seemed to show that if she took the cash and he kept the car, house, and furniture, everything would be split equally between them. They had very few liabilities other than the mortgage and outstanding credit card balances. The spreadsheet indicated that everyone would be responsible for their own credit card debt, so at least they wouldn't have to worry about that. As he looked at the numbers more closely, He realized that it all depended on whether he would accept his share as equity in an overvalued house with furnishings that were hardly worth what they both claimed. He realized that if he tried to get his share of the $20,000 in cash, it would never happen because their figures did not include the realtor and legal costs of selling the house. Everything looked good on paper, and that was exactly what he expected from the loan shark attorney. Shoving the papers back into the envelope, Kevin drove to his bank, where he was able to arrange a line of credit that would cover his outstanding mortgage payment and anything else that might come up before he got his next paycheck and deposited it. He hoped he could financially handle the mortgage, the new loan, and all the household expenses until he got things sorted out. He could always count on their savings to help them deal with fluctuations in income or unexpected expenses that came up from time to time. He knew it would take him at least a couple months to get things under control. The next 2 weeks passed for Kevin on a wave of emotion. The day after his visit with Crosby and Knox, he received an official letter warning him to stay away from Carrie and Bradley Knox, or a harassment charge would be filed against him, as well as an order to stay at least 100 yards away from them. This infuriated him so much that he almost decided to remind them to bluff, but eventually realized that it would probably work against him. A week later, his anger returned when he received notice that Carrie had filed for divorce using the settlement terms they'd both sent him in a spreadsheet. The $200 and a couple more hours of lost wages led to another lawyer in a three-piece suit telling him that while the settlement might not be entirely fair, he would spend more than it was worth to fight it. When he wasn't pestered with letters and notices from Carrie and Trey, Kevin's life began to get better. 3 weeks after Carrie left, he realized that he still needed to work on erasing the memories of her from his home. Every time he entered the bedroom, he saw the image of her sitting at the makeup table she always used or lying on the bed reading a book, one of her favorite leisure activities. He began to change things around the house to create a new atmosphere, first removing the makeup table and putting it away for storage in the basement. He found that he was able to rearrange the furniture in the bedroom to give the room a new look that he and Carrie hadn't used. In the bathroom, he was able to remove some of the jewelry she had hung on the walls and gave the room a new look as well. When he was done, he felt better and was able to call the house his own. While he was making changes to the house, he realized that there were more obvious reminders of Carrie that he would have to deal with. They were pictures of her or the two of them that hung on several walls and stood on end tables and the mantel in the living room. One evening, he decided he would remove all these images and reminders of her and went around the house taking the pictures out of their frames and putting them in a box he found in the basement. Once he was done with that, he moved on to their collection of photo albums that were stored in a bookcase in the living room. The first album he picked up contained almost nothing but pictures of the two of them, and after removing a few that depicted him alone or friends he still treasured, he put the book with the remaining pictures in the box. The next album was of their wedding, and the only pictures he kept from it were of him and his parents. They had passed away after the wedding, and those pictures were the last he kept of them. The rest of the book went into a box. He continued flipping through the pages of the remaining albums, leaving most of the pictures and then putting the books in the box. The last album he took from the shelf contained mostly photos he had brought into their marriage. Many of them were of his childhood and school years, but there were also a few pictures of Carrie that he took out and added to the stack in the box. Leafing through a book of memories of his younger years, he came across one that made him stop. It was a picture of him with Carol Reese, his friend from most of his high school years. He wondered what she was doing now and what happened to her after she left for university. They broke up when she left and he ended up going to trade school and Carrie went to university. The entire picture book was placed neatly back on the shelf, and the small stack of pictures he had saved from other books was put on top to add to later. For the moment, he thought he had done enough and would return to the photos another day. He had managed to get rid of the last overt reminders of Carrie, although that didn't spare him from thinking about her a lot during the day, and especially at night as he lay in their marital bed. Before going to bed, he pulled out the local phone book and looked through the entries for Reese. Carol wasn't there, which didn't surprise him, but neither was her widowed mother, Mary Ann Reese. He still remembered their address, but it wasn't listed under any of Reese's names. There were only a few entries for the Reeses, and none of them related to his memories of Carol. Having satisfied his curiosity, he set the book aside and no longer thought of the only woman who had ever meant anything to him. About 6 weeks after Carrie's hasty departure from his life, Kevin was disturbed by a knock on the front door, tearing him away from his late-night time-killing TV camera sessions. Night after night he sat and watched shows that had absolutely no meaning to him other than as a means of filling the hours between dinner and bed. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see it was Carrie's brother, Robert Kane. "Hello, Robert." "Come on in. Didn't expect to see you." Kevin stepped back to let Carrie's older brother into the house. Once past Kevin, Robert turned, patted his brother-in-law on the shoulder and said, "What's up, Kevin? I tried to call you, but the message said your number was no longer in service." "Oh yes, I gave up my regular phone service and now only use my cell phone." "I don't see the need for the extra expense." Kevin led the man into the living room where they sat down in separate armchairs. "Can I offer you a beer, Robert?" "Sure, Kevin, I don't mind." Kevin stepped out for a moment and returned with 2 open bottles, handing one to his longtime friend. "I don't think you'll want to have a glass with that." "No, I don't." Both men sipped from their bottles, after which Kevin asked, "So, what brings you here? I was wondering if you'd ever be around again after Carrie left." Robert shifted a little uncomfortably in his chair, then said, "As a matter of fact, that's why I'm here. You know she's been my wife's best friend for a long time, and 2 days ago Carrie stopped by to visit her. I told Carrie what I thought about her cheating on you with her boss, and afterward Carrie and Susan retired to the kitchen to talk privately. I went out to the garage because I was too angry with her to stay here. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Robert, but I don't want to come between you and your sister. What's done is done, and I'm trying to move on with my life. Well, she's my little sister, and I know that in time it will come between me and her, but right now I don't really need her. I know my parents aren't thrilled either, but they'll stick by her no matter what." Kevin glanced glumly at his beer and said, "Family first." Robert continued, "Anyway, I left the kitchen door ajar when I went to the garage and overheard their conversation. Although I wasn't interested in talking to her, I decided to hear what Carrie had to say for herself. I went and sat by the kitchen door and just listened." Kevin was obviously interested in what Robert had to say, so he leaned forward and asked, "Did she have anything to say about it? I'm still trying to figure out what she found in this guy besides his money." "I think you hit the sweet spot. I can't quote them word for word, but I can give you the gist of their conversation. When you caught her emailing you, she quickly made the decision to dump you and go to her boss. She realized you would never forgive her, so she chose Plan B." "Wasn't she already committed to him?" Kevin asked, looking a little puzzled. "Apparently not, from what I've heard. She told Susan that while the gifts and lifestyle with Bradley are great, she said you outclass him by a mile in the bedroom. She said she would have broken up with him very soon, maybe even next week if you hadn't caught her." "Would've, could've, should've. It doesn't matter now." Kevin sipped more from his bottle and leaned back in his chair. "She understands that. She knows it's over. I just thought you might be interested to know that she's really regretting all of this right now. That hasn't stopped her from going full speed ahead with the divorce, of course. I got the new papers from the court today. I guess Trey has a friendly judge who is speeding up the process for her. I never heard anything about it from her. But I've heard them both use the expression starter husband. It sounds like they've talked about it before, and when she first started dating him, she thought he'd be a step up for her. The other thing is that Susan obviously knew about all of this from the beginning. I'm so upset with Susan that I hesitate to bring it up with her for fear of what I might say. So she thinks of me as her starting husband. Isn't that wonderful?" Kevin paused to get his anger under control before continuing. "I don't want you fighting with Susan over me, Robert. It wasn't just Carrie who thought that. From the tone of their conversation, it sounds like Susan may have harbored the same thoughts as Carrie. I'm going to talk to her about all of this soon as I feel I can talk to her without losing my temper. My wife has a lot to answer for." The conversation continued for another half hour, after which Robert got up to leave. He added a few more minor details from the overheard conversation, but nothing of significance to Kevin, who was still thinking about his starter husband when he finally fell asleep a couple hours later. The next day after work, Kevin stopped by one of the larger grocery stores that were on his way home. He decided it was time to start eating healthier, something better than the fast food he had been eating for the past 6 weeks. He had just had time to put the card on the checkout line when the cashier asked, "Aren't you Kevin Riley?" Kevin looked up and immediately recognized her as a former classmate. "Hi, Wendy. I didn't realize you worked here." "It's been a while." They continued their pleasant conversation while Wendy checked his order. After paying, Kevin asked, "Wendy, you were very friendly with Carol Reese. Have you heard anything about what became of her or her mother?" Wendy thought for a moment before answering, "I remember hearing that she had gotten married, but that was years ago. Her mother still lives in the same house, although she remarried a few years ago." "I haven't heard that. Do you know Mrs. Reese's new last name?" Wendy thought a moment longer and replied, "Smith, I think. Perhaps Smitherman or Smithson." Agreeing to meet sometime for coffee, the old friends said their goodbyes. Returning home, Kevin was in a better mood than he had been in a long time. Meeting an old friend had brought back many fond memories, and he was grateful for any opportunity to take his mind off of thoughts of his soon-to-be ex-wife. After cooking himself a healthy dinner, he went for a short jog for the first time in weeks to warm up for what he decided would be his new nightly routine: proper nutrition followed by regular exercise. Shortly after returning from his jog, he decided to look up Carol's mother's phone number and soon found it in the phone book under the name Smithers. Realizing that time was of the essence now, he dialed the number. Soon, Kevin was already on the phone with Marianne Smithers and got straight to the point. "I was hoping to get Carol's address. I thought I might write to her just to say hi. I was just on my way out to see her. Her name is Carol Jansen now, and you don't need to write to her, you can just call her." She gave him the phone number and added that Carol was now a widow. Since she was in a hurry to leave, they said a quick goodbye. After their conversation, Kevin found Carol Jansen in the phone book and noticed that her address was in an area of town known as a disadvantaged, low-income neighborhood. He was quite surprised by this and wondered why Carol would live there. He decided that one day he would be sure to call her. Over the next few days, Kevin changed. His new healthy lifestyle affected his attitude towards life, and he was now much more upbeat at work. He began to imagine that life without Carrie was possible after all. Just as he was beginning to come around, a new letter from Carrie got him thinking. It was a very short letter consisting of just one line that simply said, "I never thought of you as a starter husband." It was obvious that Robert and Susan had discussed what Robert had been pondering when he left Kevin a few days ago. Susan had apparently relayed the information that Robert had overheard the women talking and passed it on to Kevin. That message brought back to Kevin everything he had been trying to forget. After pondering her message for a few minutes, he sent her a reply. Actions speak louder than words. She never responded to that comment. Almost exactly 3 months after Carrie left their home for Trey, Kevin received the final divorce papers. Trey's apparent ability to get those papers through the system surprised him. Returning from his usual run, he celebrated his status as one of the newly divorced with a single glass of cold beer. After finishing it, he went to his computer and sent Carrie a text. "You got what you wanted." It was the last email between them, and she never responded to it. Later that evening, after rereading and putting the divorce decree away in a folder, Kevin decided it was time to call Carol Jansen and say hi to her. He had thought about calling her several times over the past few weeks since he had been given her number, but wasn't ready to take that step yet. Since he was divorced and she was a widow, he thought that perhaps they could share a dinner or a couple drinks one night to reminisce about old times. With that thought in mind, he dialed her number. When she answered, he had just had time to introduce himself when she said, "Kevin, I'm so glad you called. My mom told me you called, and I was beginning to think you had decided not to call me." The two old friends spent the next hour telling each other about the highlights of their lives after graduation. Kevin learned that Carol had married Frank Jansen in her last year of university. He was in the National Guard and was called up to serve in Iraq. 3 months after his arrival there, she received word that a man on a bicycle had blown himself up at the checkpoint her husband was guarding, killing him and another soldier. This left her a widow with a 4-year-old daughter, Chrissy. The two of them lived on the survivor's pension she received from the Army. But as soon as her daughter was old enough to go to school, Carol planned to return to her specialty work as a therapist. Kevin, for his part, told Carol about his new status and some of the details of how and why he had become newly divorced. Eventually, it was time for them to say goodbye, as Carol needed to put her daughter to bed. Kevin decided that now would be a good time to see if Carol would be interested in dating him. "So, Carol, what do you think about getting together for dinner or a couple drinks one night?" Carol hesitated before answering. "I'm sorry, Kevin, but I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Right now, I'm more concerned about my daughter than anything else. Maybe some other time." Kevin was very disappointed, for he had thought they would be reunited after all these years. It's okay, Carol. I hope I didn't upset you with my questions. Goodbye and good luck, Carol. He found her response made him very concerned, so he quickly hung up. The fact that he was officially divorced and then rejected by his old girlfriend made him return to the refrigerator for another beer, and after finishing it, he went straight to bed. It was an emotionally difficult day for him. The next 2 months went by quickly. Kevin had gotten used to the routine, and he knew that eventually he would have to decide what to do with the rest of his life. He knew there was no point in getting into a new relationship, so he put that part of his life on hold, wanting to wait until Carrie was banished to the back of his mind. He still found it difficult to go more than a few hours without thinking about her, although he could tell that those recurring memories were becoming less and less disturbing to him as time passed. Kevin had given up newspaper delivery months ago when he'd given up his landline phone and premium cable channels in an attempt to cut costs. Now he preferred to read newspapers left in the lunchroom by coworkers who didn't often bring them to work. Occasionally he listened to the local news on the radio, but again not on a regular basis. It was in this uninformed state that he went to work that morning. During his morning coffee break, he was having a lively working conversation with another mechanic when one of them threw a newspaper in front of him and said, "You better read this, Kevin." Kevin picked up the paper and read the headline, "One dead, one in critical condition." The accompanying article told of a fatal accident the night before on the road, leading away from the local country club. The driver lost control of the car, and it went into a ditch where it rolled over several times. The driver, identified as Bradley Knox 3, was ejected from the car. The passenger, Carrie Riley, suffered serious injuries and is now in intensive care at a local hospital. The police report indicated that alcohol may have caused the accident. After rereading the article twice, Kevin threw the paper back to the man who gave it to him and said, "Can't say I'm sorry to see him dead. I hope Carrie pulls through, but other than that, I think I care about her too much to worry." The man looked at him carefully and then said, "Are you sure, Kevin?" "I know her leaving hit you hard. You were pretty much useless around here for a while," he said, laughing. "Yeah, I'm sure it did. Reading that article proved it to me. Now I have only normal human compassion for her. I have not the slightest desire to rush to her bedside." Reading that article was a turning point for Kevin. He could now admit to himself that he had indeed experienced the memories of Carrie and felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. As much as he felt sorry for her and her parents, he was happy that he had reached the point where he realized he could move on with his life. Over the next few days, local news outlets confirmed that Bradley Knox 3 was under the influence of alcohol when he drove off the road. In the same reports, Carrie was still unconscious and in critical condition. Kevin's reaction to this news was to invite one of the secretaries over for dinner, which they both enjoyed. He was very pleased to be enjoying the woman's company again. They made no plans for future dates, but it was enough for Kevin to know that he was completely out of the rut he had been in for so long. About 2 weeks after the accident, well after it was no longer news, Kevin answered a late evening knock on the door and found Robert Kane there. He invited him in, and soon both men were sitting in the kitchen, each with a cold bottle of beer in his hand. "What brings you here, Robert?" "It's been a while." "Nothing much, Kevin." "I was in the neighborhood, as they say." "I was sorry to hear about the accident Carrie was in. I think it's very disturbing to your family. There hasn't been anything in the papers lately. Is she feeling any better?" Robert took a long sip of beer before answering, "Yes, it's been terribly hard on Mom and Dad. She had a pretty serious head injury when she was thrown back while the car was moving. Thank goodness she was wearing her seatbelt. That jackass she was riding with didn't buckle up and she paid for it. Looks like Carrie paid a big price for his decision to drink and drive. Someone should sue his estate for her injuries." Robert sighed and said, "Yeah, Dad and I talked about that. Carrie is still in a drug-induced coma. She had to have major brain surgery because of the blow to her head. Once the swelling goes down, they will take her off the drugs and see if she comes out of the coma or not. They don't make any guarantees. I didn't know she was in such bad shape. The news always just said she was in the ICU. Tell your parents hello when you see them." Robert looked at Kevin and said, "I will. Thanks for your concern. They were actually wondering why you didn't stop by the hospital. I tried to explain to them that you have your own life now and Carrie is no longer a part of it." Kevin laughed softly and said, Yeah, I think I've been able to move on with my life now. I went on my first date in years the other day. While I'm sorry she was hurt so badly, I'm not going to let it affect my life. A year ago, I would have lost my mind in this situation, but Carrie has spared me from that. They continued talking about sports and work and didn't return to the subject of Carrie until the very end of Robert's visit. As he was about to walk out the door, he said, "By the way, Kevin, I think Susan and I have gotten over that whole problem I talked to you about last time. She saw the mess Carrie was in before the accident and decided she would be more than happy to be my wife. I guess this is the case where the grass always seems greener." "I'm glad to hear that, Robert." It was probably Carrie who confused Susan. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Carrie forgot her obligations to me in our marriage. It could have been much worse. We could have had children. They shook hands and Robert left to return to his home. Another 6 weeks passed quickly for Kevin. He heard nothing more about what had happened to Carrie and assumed her recovery was going well. Kevin was able to become more involved in dating, and throughout this time he went out on an average of once a week. He went out a couple times with Jean, the receptionist from work, and spent a couple nights with her at her apartment. Neither of them expected their relationship to go too far, but they both enjoyed their time together. The nights in her bed had helped him get rid of his last doubts about getting back into the dating pool. It was a Thursday evening, and Kevin had just returned from his evening run when he heard the doorbell of his house ring. Opening the door, he was very surprised to see his former father-in-law on the doorstep. "Come in, Joseph. To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" The elderly man stopped on the threshold and said, "I can't come in right now, as I am on my way to the hospital. I would like to ask you to come into the hospital and see Carrie with her mother and me. She just arrived this week finally. We were hoping you could meet us there tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Kevin looked at him curiously and replied, "I guess I can. But what's the big deal? Why do you need me to visit her? Our marriage has been over for a long time." Joseph breathed a sigh of relief and said, "We'd just like you to meet us there if you can. We'll talk things over then. Right now I'm in a big hurry. I'll see you tomorrow." The older man quickly turned around and hurried back to his car, leaving Kevin standing at his own front door in bewilderment. The next day, Kevin rearranged his schedule so that he could have a late lunch and then start the weekend early by making the agreed-upon trip to the hospital. That's what happened. He left the store at 1 p.m. and instead of stopping for lunch, snacked on fruit from his bag as he drove. He arrived at the hospital early, but decided to go up to Carrie's room anyway. Maybe he could get it done even faster than planned. It was already 2:30 when he stepped off the elevator on Carrie's floor. He'd been given the room number at the front desk on the first floor, and he saw right away that it was directly across from the nurse's station. He hadn't noticed it affecting him before, but now it was obvious that he was actually a little nervous. He hadn't seen Carrie since his angry visit to her office on Crosby and Knox and hadn't even exchanged emails with her in months. He was sure this could be a strain on him. Taking a deep breath, he quietly stepped through the open door of her private room and froze, staring intently at the scene before him. Carrie was clearly asleep. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was now only 2 inches long, obviously shaved off weeks ago for surgery. At least one scar was visible on the right side of her head, not yet completely hidden by the growing hair. To her right was an infusion pump leading to an 4 in her right arm. To her left was a rack on which stood the heart monitoring equipment. The screen displayed a continuous heart rate monitor, along with numbers showing her pulse rate, blood pressure, and oxygen percentage. A bundle of wires ran from the machine to sensors attached to her body. To avoid waking her up, Kevin decided to wait for his parents to arrive. He was actually delighted to see her again. She was as beautiful as ever. Her face and neck bore no marks of the accident, nor did her hands and arms. Only the scar on her head testified to the terrible accident she had been involved in. For a moment, he had the urge to walk over and take her hand, but it quickly passed when he remembered the contents of the letters he had found so long ago. His jaw clenched, and he reaffirmed his intention to wait. He had been watching her for about 2 minutes when her eyes slowly opened and focused on him. As if a switch had been turned on, her face suddenly lit up and she said, "Kevin, you're here. Where have you been? I've missed you so much these past 3 days. No one could tell me where you were." Kevin was completely taken aback by her reaction and questions and replied, "Where do you think I've been?" "I've been home and at work." Carrie reacted to that answer with a confused look and asked, "Why weren't you here when I woke up?" Why would you go to work or stay home when I was here? His confusion was even worse than hers, and he was a little angry at her questions. He quickly replied, "Why would you wait here for me? We are divorced. You left me for your lover. Why the hell should I visit you? I'm only here because your parents wanted me to come." Her reaction completely surprised and amazed Kevin, as she immediately shrieked and tried to move toward him. She was obviously extremely agitated and spoke, "No, no, no. What are you saying?" She began waving her arms around, trying to free herself from the restraining equipment and tubing. After a few seconds, she ripped the 4 out of her right arm. The alarm on the infusion pump sounded a steady beep and was soon joined by the loud and shrill beeping of the heart monitoring equipment when Carrie managed to pull hard enough on the cables to disconnect them from the machine. A few seconds after the alarm sounded, 2 nurses came running in from a neighboring room. The first of them looked at Kevin and asked him, "What did you do to her?" She then rushed past him to Carrie, grabbed her by her twitching arms and forced her back onto the bed. She paid no attention when Kevin answered her question. "I didn't do anything. I was here at the door the whole time." Carrie mumbled something incoherently, trying to break free from the nurse's strong arms. The second nurse quickly assessed the situation and said, "I'll get the restraints and call the doctor for permission to sedate her." She turned and hurriedly left the room. Kevin walked slowly out of the hospital room, finally turning around and shaking his head as he headed for the elevator. "I think she's crazy," he said to no one in particular. As he reached the elevator, the doors opened and Carrie's parents stepped out in front of Kevin. Before they could say a word to him, screams and yelling came from Carrie's room, and their attention was caught by a nurse rushing into the room with staples and a hypodermic syringe in hand. "What happened?" Carrie's mother looked at Kevin fearfully and continued, "You didn't talk to her, did you?" When he answered in the affirmative, she said, "Good God, no!" And the 2 of them rushed past him into her room. Kevin was completely confused by the strange situation unfolding in front of him, and after watching and listening to what was happening for a few seconds, he reached out and pressed the elevator down button. As he entered the elevator and the doors began to close in front of him, he saw Carrie's father leave the room, obviously looking for him. Kevin managed to raise his hand in a farewell greeting before the doors closed completely. Satisfied that he was able to start the weekend even earlier than he expected, Kevin drove straight home after leaving the hospital. On the way, he reviewed the strange scenes that had taken place before his eyes in Carrie's room. None of it made any sense to him, and he decided to forget about it. He tried to fulfill Joseph Kane's request, but Carrie's reaction to his visit quickly put an end to his efforts. He was sure she was left with psychological problems from the accident that he could happily leave to her parents and doctors. Let them deal with it, he decided. After he showered and changed his clothes, what he had been thinking about from time to time over the past few weeks came back to him. He decided to call Carol Jansen one last time, hoping that she might reconsider her refusal to join him for dinner. If she refused again, he decided that he would call Jean at the office and invite her over for the evening. He felt he needed female company to take his mind off Carrie and her strange behaviors. He almost hung up when the phone started ringing, not knowing if he would want to meet another of Carol's refusals to go out with him. But the opportunity to do so disappeared when Carol picked up the phone. "Hi, Carol. This is Kevin Riley calling. I hope I didn't catch you busy." Kevin: "No, I'm not busy at all. I'm so glad you called me again. I've tried several times to contact you, but the number listed in the book doesn't work. I was afraid you had moved or something. I wanted to apologize for being so harsh with you the last time you asked me out. I gave up that phone and now only use my cell phone." "You don't need to apologize, Carol. I'm old enough to handle rejection," he said. "Actually, I called to see if he changed his mind and would like to have dinner with me tonight or tomorrow night." He waited patiently to see what excuse she would offer. Carol hesitated before replying. "I have plans with my mom and stepdad tomorrow. It's their anniversary." After another hesitation, she continued. "I'm afraid tonight is canceled too, because I couldn't find a babysitter for Chrissy on such short notice." She was genuinely unhappy that she had to turn him down. "You know, there's a simple solution. We can just take Chrissy with us. You've told me so much about her, I'd really like to meet her." After that, Kevin decided that if she made any more excuses, it would be clear that she wasn't interested in going out with him. Carol laughed and said, I doubt you've ever gone out to dinner with a 4-year-old, have you? Taking a child with you puts serious restrictions on the restaurants you can go to. Well, maybe pick a place where she's comfortable. I just know I'd like to take you out, and a family restaurant seems like a great option. He waited patiently for her answer, realizing it was now or never. Deep down, he really wanted her to say yes. He believed the two of them had unfinished business. Their breakup after high school was due to the realities of their curriculums, not some obvious mismatch of feelings. If you're serious, there's this restaurant that Chrissy really likes. The food and atmosphere there is very nice, even though it's considered a family restaurant. There's a great dessert bar there that Chrissy just loves. Then it's settled. I'll pick you up at 5. You'll have to tell me where the place is. Kevin was very pleased, and his pleasure was evident in the tone of his voice. Carol was excited too as she replied, You don't mind taking Chrissy? Are you sure about that? Kevin laughed and replied, Absolutely. If she's anything like her mother, I'm sure she'll be a pleasure to hang out with. I've always found you to be one of the most polite and well-mannered people I've ever met. They continued to banter with each other until Carol said it was time for her to leave to get them both ready to leave. Kevin was thrilled to be on the phone. He was happier than he had ever been in a long time. He sincerely hoped that their evening would be everything he had envisioned it to be. Later that night, as he lay in bed waiting for sleep to fall over him, Kevin was going over the details of his date with Carol and Chrissy in his head. He lay there smiling, pleased with how well it had turned out. Now he was looking forward to Sunday morning, for he had agreed to accompany them both to church, a Sunday ritual he had weaned himself on years ago. It wasn't that he was anxious to hear the sermon. It was just that he wanted to spend more time with the 2 Jansen women he had just invited to dinner. He remembered the beginning of their evening as he pulled up to the apartment building where Carol lived. He was shocked by the beautiful woman who met him at the door, so changed in so many little ways from what he remembered of her. Their last meeting had been over 10 years ago. Her dark hair was now cut short, which suited her well. For some reason, she seemed taller, but he was sure it was just an artifact of his memory. She had gotten fat in all the right places, but the beautiful smile and dark eyes he remembered were still there. The first time he saw her, it took his breath away. Chrissy looked like a miniature of her mother, with the same dark hair and eyes. Carol said she had her father's nose and chin, though Kevin thought to himself that even in those areas, she looked more like her mother. Chrissy shook his hand gently when they were introduced, and he noticed that she was scrutinizing him closely. So closely that Kevin wondered if the child would object to him showing interest in her mother. He had heard of several cases where incompatibility with children doomed any relationship between their parents and a potential suitor. His fears were quickly dispelled when Chrissy agreed to hold his hand as they walked from Carol's car to the restaurant. They used her car so they wouldn't have to swap the car seat for their own, and he drove while Carol got her bearings and Chrissy gave comments from her seat in the back. By the time they reached their destination, Kevin had grown quite fond of the skittish girl. Their dinner together went very well and they managed to find plenty of topics to talk about. Chrissy often interjected into the conversation, usually asking, "What's empty?" Where "hempty" meant a word either of them had used that she didn't quite understand. Kevin found this habit of hers quite amusing, while Carol seemed slightly embarrassed by the frequent interruptions. When the main course was finished, Kevin managed to get Chrissy to go with him to the dessert counter, where the two of them selected and prepared the desserts they each wanted. Carol asked for soft-serve ice cream with chocolate sauce, and Kevin managed to get Chrissy up to prepare her mother's order. Kevin's choice was simple: a slice of apple pie with ice cream, and again Chrissy did the job while he cheered her on. Her own dessert choice took the longest, as she couldn't decide which of the 3 toppings to put on the ice cream, and Kevin made her a friend for life when he suggested she get all 3. The trip to Carol's was a continuation of the good times they had enjoyed at the restaurant. Kevin walked them to the door of Carol's apartment, but all his thoughts of hugging her or kissing her goodbye were dispelled when Chrissy took her mother's hand and pulled her until she agreed to take the girl to her room, bathe her, and read her a book before bedtime. It was past noon on Sunday when Carol stopped in front of Kevin's house to drop him off after church and the brunch they had at IHOP. Chrissy was busy talking about animals, and Kevin didn't notice that there were people waiting for him to return until Carol said, "I think someone is standing at your front door." Kevin looked around and said, "Those are my former in-laws. I wonder what they want. I guess I'd better go see." Chrissy quickly got his attention back by saying, "Don't forget to take me to the zoo." She seemed worried that his unexpected company would somehow interfere with their plans for the afternoon. "I won't forget, Chrissy. You'll come back for me after you change, and I'll take you to the zoo. I promise." He smiled at the girl and her mother before getting out of the car. He stood and waved goodbye to them as they drove away, and then turned to his guests and asked, "What brings you here on such a beautiful Sunday afternoon?" Carrie's mother, Nancy, was the first to speak. "We need to talk to you. It's very important." You could tell by the look on her face that she was upset. "Sure. I'm leaving around 2 o'clock, but we can come into the house and have a cup of coffee and talk if you'd like." They went into the house and joined Kevin in the kitchen, where he started making coffee, and they sat down at the table, and Nancy Kane started talking. "Carrie is in a terrible state, Kevin. Ever since you came to see us, she has had to be sedated constantly. As soon as the medication wears off and she comes to her senses, she becomes hysterical. What is the cause and what does it have to do with me? When we asked you to meet with us on Friday, we wanted you to meet with her neurologist first. We wanted him to explain to you the condition she is in. I'm sorry, I didn't know. But what difference does it make? I've hardly told her anything anyway." Nancy whimpered, and her husband took her hand before she continued. "The problem is that you told her about her affair and the divorce. We wanted to try to avoid that until she got stronger." Kevin was puzzled and quickly asked, "Why wouldn't I mention her affair and divorce? Surely she didn't expect me to forget about it now that Trey is dead. She won't get me back by default just because he's no longer in the world." Kevin was starting to get a little upset at that assumption. Joseph picked up the conversation. Carrie had a severe head injury and almost died. Part of her temporal lobe was physically damaged, and the swelling may have affected other areas. Her doctor explained to us that she was suffering from retrograde amnesia. Amnesia? How can that be? She recognized me immediately. I assume she recognized the two of you as well. It's not that she's lost all her memory. The problem is that she's lost almost everything from the last year and a half or so, as well as scattered memories of earlier periods. When she went to the hospital, the doctors ran a lot of tests, and she was found to have large gaps in her memories of the recent past. She thinks you two just recently returned from Cancun. As Joseph spoke, Kevin poured coffee into 3 cups, and Joseph stopped to take a sip from his cup. They think that in time she'll be able to recall a lot more of the missing pieces of her memory, but they don't know when or how much will come back to her. It's like she's the main character in the movie The Bourne Identity. So you're telling me she doesn't remember the divorce or even the affair she had? I guess I could lie to her, but eventually I'd have to tell her the truth. Like I said, she won't get a free pass just because Trey is dead. Joseph couldn't wait to continue, so he said, "We don't have to tell her lies. If we do, she may form memories that aren't really true." The doctor explained that we must tell her the truth so that we can recover the memories that are still there. Her mind will fill in the gaps where something is missing, and if we tell her something completely untrue, her mind can incorporate it as a false recovered memory. Kevin was puzzled and said, "Then we're back to where we started. You say I should have told her about the affair and the divorce." Not exactly. The doctor's advice in situations like this was not to lie, just to skirt the truth. He wanted us to start giving her little bits of information so she could put the puzzle together properly. You're kind of overloading her with information. The doctor thinks some of it may have triggered memories of the affair and the divorce, but we don't know how much of that yet. Nancy Kane regained her composure and said, "Emotionally, she's not very strong yet. The news you gave her has upset her a lot. They're going to start her on another medication, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to her about everything again very soon." Over the conversation, Kevin felt a little ashamed of his words. "I'm sorry if I made things worse. I didn't realize the situation she was in." "That's okay, Kevin. We hope you can help us with her by bringing back some of her lost memories. We would like to take all of your photo albums, as the doctors say that the pictures can trigger memories that will help her reconnect with some of the lost ones. Anything else you have that might help her remember would be nice too." At the mention of photo albums, Kevin stood up and walked over to the kitchen sink, where he stood looking out the window. "I can't help you with the albums." "They're not here." Nancy looked puzzled and asked, "What do you mean they're not here?" "I mean they're gone. They left with my trash months ago. He turned and started walking down the hallway, saying, I can explain that if I print out an email for you. He was gone for several minutes, during which time Carrie's parents comforted each other. When he returned, Kevin had a printed out piece of paper, which he showed to the elderly couple. A few months ago, I deleted all the pictures I wanted to keep from our albums. A few days after that, I sent the following message to Carrie's work email. I deleted all the pictures I wanted from our albums. Any that were left I put in a box so you can do the same. Let me know where you want them sent, there or to the apartment. That's the kind of answer I got from her. Do whatever you want with them. I'm not interested. I kept them for a few weeks after that, but finally decided that if she didn't want them, and neither did I could throw them out with the trash. So that's what I did. I'm sorry. Joseph and Nancy's faces showed shock and horror. They had nothing to say, and after thinking about the situation, Kevin added, There are a few other things I can give you besides this message. I'll go get them. It'll take me about 15 minutes, so pour yourself some more coffee. Kevin went back to the computer room, and it was only 15 minutes before he returned. When he returned to the kitchen table, he was holding a stack of papers and a CD in a box. I printed out the entire group of letters I used to find out about the affair. Perhaps if Carrie reads them, they'll bring back some of her memories on the subject. He placed the stack in front of Nancy, who reached out to take them and begin reading. Kevin immediately took them from her hands and said, There are some very explicit passages in some of these letters. I'm not sure you should read them because I know the effect they had on me, but consider yourself warned if you decide to read them yourself. He added copies of all the legal letters that had been sent to him, including the warning letter after his visit to the Crosby and Knox office. The last item was a CD on which he had labeled Cancan. He handed it to them and said, These pictures were on the computer, and they are all I have left of our time together. I should warn you about them as well. Carrie and I visited a nudist beach while we were there, and all of these pictures were taken there. In fact, there is one picture of us dressed and sitting in lounge chairs on the beach. Carrie should probably look at the others on her own. Carrie's mother folded the papers and CD in front of her. Kevin thought it was an awfully small stack to summarize their marriage. He hoped it would help Carrie. They sat in silence for a few seconds before Nancy said, I don't think you're going to want to come to Carrie and talk to her about everything that happened between you two. Kevin thought for a moment before replying, I don't think so, at least not right now. If she wants to talk to me after she reads all of this and realizes what she did to our marriage, give me a call and I might consider it. I suppose it's impossible for you to consider trying to start over with her, her father said, with a look of hope on his face. I'm afraid I could never do that. I've spent all these months trying to get rid of my feelings for her, and I can't risk that she might turn around and do all that to me again. She chose Trey's wealth and position in society over me, and I can never give her the opportunity to do that to me a second time. Something in her nature allowed her to do that, and I can't believe that a blow to the head could have changed that trait of her character. Even if I could believe it was possible, I just wouldn't take the chance. Joseph and Nancy agreed that they understood his feelings on the matter, but they thanked him for offering to talk to Carrie later if she wished. The three of them were walking out the front door, exchanging parting words, when Carol and her daughter appeared in the driveway. Chrissy immediately informed the older couple, We're going to the zoo. We're going to see the elephants. The Khans were quick to greet mother and daughter, and even quicker to appreciate them before getting in their car and driving away. Apologizing for not being ready, Kevin invited Carol and Chrissy to come inside and wait while he changed. He was ready in just a couple minutes, and the happy trio were soon on their way to the zoo. Another month passed, and Kevin was happier than ever. He met with Carol and Chrissy at least once a week, but there was no way they could find a way to turn their relationship into a sexual one. Chrissy had managed to quash the idea several times out of her own free will. Her inability to sleep when he was in the apartment was beginning to frustrate Kevin. It must have been frustrating for Carol as well, since she suggested that they find a babysitter for their next date. That day came, and Kevin looked forward to it. They made plans to watch a movie and hit up a popular bar for some dancing, and Carol's mom agreed to watch Chrissy. The happy couple was leaving Carol's apartment that evening. It was the first time they had been able to get together as a couple. The movie and dance went very well, and at midnight Kevin suggested they stop by his house for a cup of coffee since they were nearby. Carol agreed with a smile but warned him that she couldn't count on her mother staying late. As they entered the house, Kevin said, "If you prefer wine instead of coffee, I have several bottles in the basement." When Carol agreed that was a good idea, he quickly pulled out a bottle for them to try. They had already been sipping wine and dancing to his large CD collection for half an hour when Kevin led her back to the living room couch. After a couple of the sweetest kisses, he pulled out of her embrace and picked up his cell phone. "What are you doing?" Carol asked with a smile on her face. "I'm starting to like this already." Kevin pressed a finger to her lips and said, "Give me a minute. I want to talk to your babysitter." Carol was shocked and tried to grab the phone, saying, "Don't bother my mother." "Why are you calling her?" She was alternately embarrassed and laughing as she tried unsuccessfully to reach his cell phone. The call was quickly answered and Carol stopped struggling for the phone when she heard Kevin say, "This is Kevin calling." "Everything is fine, but I'd like to ask you something, Mrs. Smithers." "Okay, Marianne. I was wondering if you were anxious to get home. I was hoping Carol could stay a little later." "I understand." "Good. That sounds wonderful." More time passed without speaking, almost a full minute before Kevin said, "I really like the way you think, Marianne." "Yes, I will tell her exactly what you told me. But she won't have to wash the sheets. I'll do that." Another short pause followed before Kevin continued. "I'll see you then. Have I mentioned how much I like the way you think? Goodbye, Marianne." Kevin laughed, ending the conversation, and Carol looked at him in confusion. "What the hell was that, Kevin?" Kevin gave another very good laugh before saying, "I'll tell you what we talked about. I think I'm going to really like your mom. Not that I haven't liked her before. She and I have always gotten along great." He paused and laughed some more. "So tell me, Kevin, what did she say?" Carol was confused and clearly didn't understand what Kevin had told her over the phone. "Well, your stepfather, Gary, joined her at your apartment. Chrissy is fine and sleeping soundly, and your mother and Gary are doing the same thing there that we were just doing here on the couch. She told me that he had a doctor's appointment today and came to your apartment to tell me that he had a prescription for some little blue pills." Kevin chuckled some more before continuing. "Your mom insists that you stay here tonight because they're going to sleep in your bed." "Well, she didn't quite put it that way. She said they don't have pajamas, so we'll have to sleep like this." A look of absolute shock appeared on Carol's face. My mom would never say anything like that. "What are you trying to pull on me?" Kevin laughed again and then said, "I forgot to mention that they were enjoying the bottle of wine you had in your closet, and I think Gary got your mom a little tipsy. She said she thinks we're good together, and you need to get over Frank. She wants you to stay here with me, and since you don't have your pajamas with you, she hopes there will be stains on the sheets in the morning. She said to tell you to be sure to change them when you get up, but I told her I'd be happy to take care of that." He stopped talking and smiled, leaning over to kiss Carol. She was very red, and when she broke the kiss, she said, "I find it hard to believe she could say that, my own mother." She looked into Kevin's eyes, trying to answer the question of what she saw there. Within minutes, they were already at it. He smiled at her and said, "Don't let me forget to change the linens in the morning. I'm sure your mom will ask when we're meeting them for breakfast." "For breakfast? What does that mean?" "Your mom wants us to meet them at IHOP for breakfast at 11 a.m. I think it'll be more of a brunch. We can skip church for a week, I guess. She said they were bringing Chrissy and that we had no excuse not to stay up late as we wanted." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Kevin was in his living room, lying on the couch, remembering the wonderful evening and morning spent with Carol. Marianne and Gary and Chrissy were already sitting and waiting for them when they arrived. Both adults were smiling as they entered, and Chrissy was laughing and waving, happy to see her mother again. As they sat down at the table, Kevin said, "Sorry we're late. I had to do some laundry." He laughed when Carol blushed and lightly slapped his arm. They continued in the same vein during the meal, constantly interjecting jokes about blue pills, sheets, and wine. Chrissy looked at one of them more than once with a question in her eyes, and the adults seemed to be confusing her. Later, as they said their goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot, Kevin kissed Carol and Chrissy and then hugged Marianne tightly. As he hugged her, he whispered in her ear, "Thank you so much for your suggestions last night. It was the push we needed." Marianne smiled at him and then pulled him to her again so he could whisper back, "I think you two are good together." You're exactly what she's needed for a long time, and Gary and I took the opportunity to test his recipe." She laughed, turned, and took her husband under her arm to walk to Carol's car. Kevin was standing in the parking lot waving as the four of them drove away, a smile playing across his face. When his cell phone rang, making him get up from the couch, he assumed it was Carol and answered the call with a cheery, "Hi." "Kevin?" Kevin recognized Joseph Kane's voice and answered, "Yes, it's me. What can I do for you, Joseph?" "Kevin, I'm calling about your offer to talk to Carrie once we've reviewed all the information you've given us. She is currently staying at our house, and she asked if we could invite you over for a cup of coffee so she could talk to you. She didn't want to call on her own as I think she is afraid you would hang up on her." Kevin was very surprised by Joseph's call and hesitated before answering, "I guess I could. I don't have anything planned for today. Would you like me to come over right now? If you could, we'd appreciate it." "Okay, I'll be right over." As he left the house, Kevin was a little worried, wondering exactly what Carrie wanted to tell him. As he walked into his former mother-in-law's house, he immediately thought of all the previous times he had been there. They had all been occasions when he had enjoyed walking through that door, but this was not one of them. Carrie wasn't home yet when he arrived, and Joseph and Nancy asked him to join them in the kitchen. After they had poured 4 cups of coffee, Joseph said, "Nancy and I will let you and Carrie talk alone, and we will go into the living room." They took their 2 cups and left, and within seconds, Carrie walked into the kitchen and sat down across from Kevin. Kevin was amazed at how good she looked. Her hair had grown back enough to be styled a little, and her hair color looked good. He noticed that she was thinner than when he had last seen her, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She looked nervous, and he wondered what she was going to say to him as she nervously twirled her handkerchief in her hands. Finally, he decided to melt the ice by saying, "You seem to be recovering well, Carrie." "Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you coming to talk to me on such short notice. I hope it wasn't a problem because it could have waited until a more convenient time for you." Her voice was softer than he remembered, and she kept twisting her handkerchief as she spoke. He wondered if he had cried as he saw her eyes fill with tears. "It's not a problem, Carrie. How's your memory problem? Are you starting to remember things yet?" She shook her head and replied, "I only remember a few things from the last year and a half. I was at Crosby and Knox, and the receptionist was kind enough to show me around and tell me a little about my time there. Some things seemed familiar, and some things I was able to figure out after talking to her. I learned that she and I were good friends during my time there, but I didn't remember anything about her from the time I worked there. It was very frustrating. I can imagine what it would have been like. Are there things you want me to talk to you about? Things you think I could help you recover?" Kevin found that talking to her was easier than he had expected. Carrie smiled and said, "I do have a few questions. I spent a lot of time talking to Susan, and she really helped me understand some of the things I did." She was still fiddling with her handkerchief and periodically dabbed her eyes with it. Kevin took another sip of coffee and said, "Don't be afraid to ask me anything. I'll try to be as honest with you as possible. Before I ask, I want to tell you that I am truly sorry for the way I treated you. If I hadn't seen copies of the letters and talked to the others, I never would have believed I could have done that." She wiped her eyes more often now. Kevin had nothing to say to that. There was no way he could bring himself to say, "It's okay," considering what he'd had to endure as a result of her cheating and its aftermath. Carrie broke the silence by continuing, "I only have vague memories of Bradley and nothing about our times. All I know about it is second-hand information." She was silent for almost a minute before she continued. "I've seen pictures of him and heard his description from some of the people at the law firm. He wasn't well liked, and I have no idea what I could find in him. I've even been to his apartment, and if my clothes and belongings weren't there, I'd never believe I lived with him." The tears were flowing faster and faster, and she had to keep wiping her eyes. Kevin continued to sit in silence, waiting for Carrie to ask her questions. Again, after a long pause, she continued, "There was one question that none of the others could give me a complete answer to. I wanted to know how you knew about what I was doing. I know it had something to do with email, but I don't know how." Kevin told her how he had discovered the first message and how it had led him to the others. As he spoke, she opened a drawer and pulled out a tattered and battered stack of papers, the letters he had given to her parents. He explained to her how the mention of the lingerie set had caught his attention, and then told her that she had originally told him about buying the set. He continued the story about what she had told him about the purse and earrings. She looked at him in horror as she listened to him retell the lies she had told him. When he was done, they had to wait for her to come to her senses and wipe her watery eyes. When she was finally able to do so, she said, "Forgive me for lying. I know you think it's easy for me to say this, but I really do." A few minutes later, she asked, "While we're on the subject of letters, can you tell me about the one where Bradley and I were joking about my chauffeur?" "I wish you hadn't asked. Where you joked that your chauffeur would get you to him, you're talking about me. Every trip you made to the state capitol, I drove you to the airport and carried your luggage to the check-in counter. I delivered you to him and even carried your bag with the expensive lingerie you were going to wear for him. You both thought it was funny." Just thinking about that bit of information he had gleaned from the emails made him angry again, so he continued, "You both weren't just joking about it. You both also talked about how you would have to talk me into calling your hotel room at the beginning of the evening." He went on to describe how he always called around 9:45 and how he was able to prove that she was not in the room before or after his calls. It was easy for her to see that he was still angry about this. She started to cry again, but after a couple minutes she was able to say again, "I'm so sorry, Kevin. I just can't understand how I could have done that." Kevin took a long sip of coffee before he continued, "It's all in the past now, Carrie. I still get upset when I remember some things, but I've had plenty of time to get over almost all of it." The conversation drifted away from the subject of the letters and moved on to her medical condition. She explained to Kevin that she was having infrequent seizures and the doctors were trying various medications to control them. Emotionally, she couldn't think about work and had already permanently resigned from Crosby and Knox. Her parents were consulting with an attorney, and she expected them to start a lawsuit against the insurance company and Bradley's estate for the injuries she sustained in the accident. After about 15 minutes of small talk, Kevin announced that it was time for him to leave. "Before you go, Kevin, I wanted to ask you if you think we could go on a date. I know you'll probably never be able to forgive the new Carrie who betrayed you so horribly, but I'm the same old Carrie again. I don't remember cheating on you or anything like that. Maybe if we went out to dinner or some other date, you could fall in love with the old Carrie again someday." She said all of this quickly, wanting to get it all out before he could say anything to stop her. Kevin thought about what to say before answering, "I'm sorry, Carrie. There is no old or new Carrie in my mind. There is only one Carrie, the one I fell in love with, and then lost to Trey. It took me a long time to get over her, but I'm happy with where I've come to. I know that's not what you want to hear, and I understand that." As he spoke, she began to cry quietly again. When he got up to leave, she asked, "Did you find someone else?" He hesitated again before answering, not knowing how his words would affect her. "I think so, Carrie. I think so. Is that the dark-haired woman with the little girl?" A look of surprise appeared on Kevin's face when he said, "Yes, that's her. How did you know?" "My parents saw her when they were in the house. They told me about her." Carrie was still wiping her eyes as she said this. Finally, she said, "You deserve someone who will treat you better than me." After she finished speaking, she turned and ran out of the room. Kevin left the room and was gone long before Carrie's parents realized that he and Carrie were no longer in the kitchen. A month later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in April, Gary and Kevin used a rented truck to move Carol and Chrissy from their apartment to Kevin's house. Things were going so well between them that they decided to find out that they were meant to be together. Chrissy was excited to have a yard to play in her own big room. Kevin's computer had been moved to a corner of the living room, and the room it was in was now freshly painted and decorated for a little girl. There was a large box in the garage with a child's playset and swing set waiting to be assembled. The three of them began to attend church regularly every Sunday, and soon Kevin noticed that Carrie's parents didn't attend the same church very often. He didn't give it much thought when, 4 months after Carol moved in with him, the minister announced that they were getting married this coming Saturday and that anyone from the congregation was welcome to attend the wedding. They decided that a small, informal wedding was what they needed and chose their church rather than City Hall for the ceremony. Chrissy was thrilled that she would be her mother's only flower maid and that she would soon have a new father. Kevin was quick to let her know that Frank Jansen would always be her father, but that he would be happy to be her father. He and Carol agreed that Chrissy would keep her father's last name even if they made a legal adoption. Kevin insisted that the sacrifice Frank had made would not result in him losing his only child, and Kevin and Carol spent an hour on the phone with Frank's parents, explaining their upcoming wedding and their plans to keep Chrissy in the Jansons' lives. The conversation ended with a promise to visit Chrissy's paternal grandparents for a week for the rest of the summer. Kevin couldn't wait to meet them, and they decided that this trip could be their honeymoon. Their simple wedding ceremony went off without a hitch, and friends and family gathered at the church. It was obvious to some that Carol was pregnant, and Chrissy made sure that everyone in the church knew that she was having twin brothers. It was hard to tell what Chrissy was more excited about, the impending arrival of two brothers or the fact that Kevin was now her father. A week later, when Kevin was changing the exhaust system before a trip to visit the Jansons, he ran into his former brother-in-law, Robert Kane. He was surprised to learn that Robert and Susan had accompanied Carrie to the wedding the previous week. They had only stayed until the end of the service, as Carrie had found it much more difficult to be there than she had expected. Kevin, for his part, had a hard time understanding how Carrie could have come to his wedding. Why did she want to be there? I know how upset she was when I told her about my affair with Carol. Seeing us get married must have kept her busy. Robert replied, "Now she's trying to get over you as you are over her. She thought that watching you get married would make it easier for her to move on with her life. It bothered her a lot, but she said she was glad she went." The men continued to make small talk until Robert said, "I almost forgot to tell you. Carrie's claim against Bradley Knox's insurance company has been settled. Since it doesn't look like she'll ever be able to work again, she managed to get almost $2 million. Part of the deal was that she would get his apartment, so that's where she lives now. We couldn't figure out why she wanted to do this, but she said she hopes living there will help her regain lost memories. Personally, I don't think that's likely. The doctors seem to think she has recovered everything that can be recovered. I'm afraid the constant reminders of that asshole won't be good for her mental state. Considering he's dead, you're remarried, and she only remembers the good times spent with you. I think it's a mistake." 2 years passed quickly for Kevin and Carol. Their two sons, Frank and Kevin Jr., were joined by a younger sister, Chrissy. They named their daughter Mary Ann in honor of her grandmother. Their house was beginning to feel cramped for their growing family, and they were already debating whether to add an addition or buy a larger one. They hadn't made a decision yet, figuring they had another year before they would be forced to make a decision. It was a quiet Friday evening when the phone rang and Carol picked it up. After a moment, she called Kevin to the phone. When he picked up, he was surprised to hear that Joseph Kane was calling. "I had to call you, Kevin, so you wouldn't find out about this tomorrow from the paper. Carrie is dead. Robert found her when he went to see her today. Apparently, she died sometime yesterday." The news took Kevin by surprise, and he lost control of himself for a moment. His reaction was enough for Carol to realize something was wrong, and she stepped forward and took his hand in hers. Her reassuring touch and concerned look brought him back to the present. He was happily at home with Carol and their children. His brief reaction was caused by a flash of long-forgotten memories of Carrie, memories he knew could never be completely erased. He smiled encouragingly at Carol, then said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Joseph. I would like to extend my sincere condolences to you, Nancy and Robert. Do you have any idea what happened to her?" Joseph hesitated before answering. I'm afraid she killed herself. She left a note for my mother and I, but it's mostly personal things meant just for us. She wanted us to tell you that she never stopped loving you. Apparently she tried, but was never able to get rid of the memories of you. She also wanted you to know that it wasn't just you. She had ongoing health problems, both physical and mental, and they played a part in it too. I didn't know she had so many problems. I haven't spoken to her since the day I came to your house to see her. I'm very sorry to hear that something like this happened. If there is anything I can do to help you or Nancy, please let me know." They exchanged a few more familiar phrases, and then the conversation ended. A few days later, Kevin and Carol attended a memorial service for Carrie, where they were able to express their personal condolences to her family. From Crosby and Knox, only her friend Anne, the receptionist, attended. Epilogue. A few months later, Kevin learned that he was the heir to $500,000 from Carrie's inheritance. Most of her estate had gone to her parents and brother. Kevin and Carol had long debated whether to keep the inheritance for themselves, as Kevin worried that it would bring back constant memories of Carrie in their lives. In the end, they kept it and set up 4 trust funds for their children's education. The balance was used to buy a new, larger home. They found that they often remembered Carrie and her generosity, but it didn't give them any trouble. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.